June 1944, Normandy, France. A grey morning fog hangs over a hedgerow field littered with the wreckage of burned-out half-tracks and blackened helmets. Among the chaos, a group of German prisoners is marched at gunpoint toward a shallow ditch. One of them still wears his black SS tunic, the silver runes on his collar half torn, half glinting in the light. An American sergeant pauses, looks at the insignia, and without a word, raises his Thompson. Moments later, the crack of gunfire echoes across the valley. No record will ever mention this incident, no report will be filed, but it was far from rare. Throughout the Second World War, captured members of Hitler's most feared elite, the Waffen-SS, faced an unspoken brutal fate. To many Allied and Soviet soldiers alike, an SS man was not a prisoner of war, he was an executioner caught in uniform. They were born out of loyalty, forged in fanaticism, and baptized in blood. The SS Schutzstaffel began not as an army, but as a bodyguard unit for Adolf Hitler, a hand-picked circle sworn to protect the Führer with their lives. Under Heinrich Himmler's iron control, they grew from a few hundred men into one of the most feared institutions in history. By 1939, the SS was everywhere, in the police, in the Gestapo, in the concentration camps, and on the battlefield. The Waffen-SS, its military wing, stood apart from the regular army, the Wehrmacht, not just by its elite training or black uniforms, but by its ideology. SS recruits were not merely taught to fight, they were taught to believe that their war was holy, that mercy was weakness, that their enemy was subhuman. Yet this indoctrination came with a price, because when the tide of war turned and the invincible Reich began to crumble, those same black runes that had once commanded terror now marked a man for death. They were not born on the battlefield, but in the echoing halls of loyalty and fear. The Schutzstaffel, the SS, began humbly in 1925 as a small, almost ceremonial guard detachment assigned to protect Adolf Hitler at public events. A handful of loyal men in crisp black uniforms whose purpose was not to fight wars but to shield their Führer from bullets and betrayal. Yet within a decade, that modest circle of bodyguards would become a paramilitary empire of terror, a state within a state, one that would command the allegiance of hundreds of thousands and the fear of millions. At its head stood Heinrich Himmler, a man of quiet voice and cold conviction who saw in the SS not a mere protective detail but the seed of a new racial aristocracy, the future ruling order of a purified Reich. From its inception, the SS was not a military organization in the traditional sense. It was a spiritual order of violence. Membership demanded more than strength or skill. It required ideological purity, ancestral proof of Aryan blood, and total submission to Nazi doctrine. Its soldiers were drilled not just to obey but to believe. They were told that compassion was treason, that pity was weakness, and that their loyalty to Hitler transcended law, conscience, and even family. Himmler's vision was terrifyingly meticulous. The SS man would be a political soldier, part warrior, part priest of a twisted creed that sanctified domination and death. As the Reich expanded, so too did this order of zealots. By 1939, when Europe once again teetered on the edge of total war, the SS had already seeped into every corner of German power. Its black-clad officers commanded the concentration camps through the Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head units, whose insignia, a silver skull, became the symbol of merciless obedience. Its intelligence wing, the Sicherheitsdienst or SD, infiltrated universities, press offices, and even churches, ensuring that no dissenting thought survived unpunished. And now, under Himmler's urging, a new branch prepared to step onto the field of battle, the Waffen-SS, the armed SS. This new military arm was to be different from the ordinary German army, the Wehrmacht. While the Wehrmacht obeyed the traditional codes of military conduct and saw themselves as soldiers of Germany, the Waffen-SS saw themselves as soldiers of ideology. Their purpose was not merely to defeat enemies but to cleanse them. They fought not for Germany's borders but for Hitler's vision of a new world. The distinction mattered deeply to Himmler. He wanted his men to view the Wehrmacht as old, cautious, and compromised by outdated notions of honor. The Waffen-SS would be something purer, a corps of fanatics, their veins filled with devotion and their hearts devoid of doubt. In training camps scattered across Bavaria and Silesia, recruits were reshaped into this mold. They marched under banners bearing runes rather than eagles, chanted slogans that glorified racial purity, and studied propaganda that portrayed them as the spearhead of civilization's renewal. They endured brutal physical trials, 20-mile marches in full gear, live fire exercises, freezing nights in mud and snow, but the most grueling conditioning was psychological. They were taught to harden their minds against mercy, to see the enemy as subhuman. Compassion is a betrayal of the blood, one SS manual read. He who hesitates before the enemy is no comrade of ours. By the time war erupted in Poland in September 1939, the Waffen-SS was still relatively small, only 4 divisions. But its impact was immediate and brutal. Civilians and prisoners who fell into their hands often vanished. Entire villages were burned in reprisal for partisan activity. Jewish communities were massacred under the justification of security operations. The SS men carried their creed like a black flame, cold, unwavering, righteous in its own perverse logic. And as their ranks swelled into the hundreds of thousands, that flame spread across Europe. To the average Allied soldier years later, these were not just enemies in uniform. The SS were the executioners of Europe, the architects of terror from Warsaw to Kiev, from Orador to Kharkov. Every whisper of an atrocity, of women shot in ditches, of prisoners hanged from barn rafters, of villagers driven into churches and burned alive, bore the same insignia: twin lightning bolts, polished silver, proud and unrepentant. That insignia burned itself into the memory of every man who fought them. By 1943, when the tide of war began to shift against Germany, the Waffen-SS divisions had become both elite and expendable. They were given the best weapons, the rapid-firing MG-42, the Tiger and Panther tanks, the newest Panzerfausts, and were expected to perform impossible feats, to hold positions against overwhelming odds, to counterattack when surrounded, to die before retreating. They fought with a suicidal determination that often left Allied soldiers shaken, but that same fanaticism made them unpredictable, dangerous even when defeated. Stories spread through the Allied lines of SS troops feigning surrender only to open fire at close range. Whether these accounts were true or born of rumor mattered little. The result was the same: deep distrust, deep hatred, and an unspoken understanding that mercy might not apply to men who wore the runes. Inside their own ranks, the indoctrination only deepened. Himmler demanded that every SS man view himself as the embodiment of Nazi destiny, a chosen warrior for a 1,000-year empire. In speeches to his officers, he spoke of the hardness of steel, of the necessity to exterminate without remorse those who threatened the racial order. The SS man, he said, must be as unyielding as granite, his conscience as clean as his uniform. To the outside world, this doctrine created monsters. To Himmler, it created perfection. When Allied soldiers eventually faced them in the fields of Normandy, in the ruins of Caen, in the Ardennes, they were not fighting ordinary Germans. They were fighting a cult. The Waffen-SS fought to the last bullet, to the last breath, often refusing surrender even when surrounded and hopeless. They fought not for survival but for martyrdom. Many carried cyanide capsules sewn into their uniforms, ready to die rather than fall into enemy hands. To the Allies, this fanatical resistance was terrifying, almost inhuman. It fostered a simple, brutal rule among many frontline troops: an SS man was not to be trusted alive. And yet, this legend of invincibility would soon turn against them. The very qualities that made the SS so feared in war, their loyalty, their ruthlessness, their insignia, would make them hated beyond redemption once the Reich began to fall. By the time the first Allied boots stepped onto French soil in 1944, the black runes no longer inspired awe, they inspired execution. Because when the world finally saw what the SS had done, when the gates of their camps were opened, when the ash of their victims fell upon the wind, the black-clad soldiers who had once stood tall as the vanguard of the master race became marked men. Every bullet they had fired in cruelty would soon find its echo. And in the shattered fields of Europe, where justice and vengeance blurred into the same grey smoke, a new, unspoken truth took root. If he wore the runes, he did not walk away. There are moments in war when the boundaries of morality dissolve, when exhaustion, grief, and fury strip away the layers of discipline that separate a soldier from a survivor. For many Allied troops in Europe, those moments came when they met the Waffen-SS face to face, not across a battlefield but in the stillness that follows victory, when the enemy had already thrown down his weapon and raised his hands. By the summer of 1944, rumors had hardened into doctrine among the Allied ranks. The letters SS had become synonymous not with soldiering but with murder. In Normandy, men whispered stories passed from one unit to another, tales of captured British commandos who had been shot in the head by SS officers, of Canadians found with their wrists tied and bullet holes in their skulls, of American prisoners massacred in cold blood after surrender. Some of these stories were confirmed by investigators, others distorted by the fog of war, but to the men fighting their way through hedgerows and ruined towns, the distinction no longer mattered. Every new rumor fed the same conclusion: if an SS man surrendered, he was playing a trick. Frontline soldiers live by instinct. They measure danger not by uniform codes or conventions but by what experience tells them is safe. And experience, by 1944, said that the black-clad enemy was never safe. There were cases, scattered, unrecorded, passed on in whispers, of Waffen-SS men dropping their rifles in mock surrender only to reach for hidden pistols or to detonate grenades strapped to their belts. Whether these incidents were common or merely magnified by fear, they confirmed a deadly superstition: mercy toward the SS was fatal. For the Allied infantrymen, already scarred by weeks of grinding combat, it was easier, perhaps necessary, to make the decision before the moment arrived. If the man before you wore the twin runes, you did not wait to find out whether he was sincere. A glance, a twitch of the hand, the faintest hint of movement, and the crack of a rifle, or the chatter of a Thompson, ended the uncertainty. In those moments, there was no time to recall the Geneva Convention, no space in the mind for its elegant promises of humane treatment. The laws of war belong to the rear echelons, not to the mud. Among the British 11th Armoured Division, one veteran later recalled, "We learned quickly. If he was SS, you didn't trust him to surrender properly. Too many of our lads went down after trusting those bastards." The same sentiment echoed in American units pushing through the bocage. One sergeant described how, after finding a group of murdered GIs in a French orchard, their hands tied behind their backs, his men made a silent pact. "If we met the SS again," he said years later, "they weren't going to make it to the prison cages." None of this was ever written in orders. No officer would have dared to issue such a command, but it did not need to be spoken. The hatred was instinctive, the kind that seeps into the blood after weeks of watching friends die in ditches, of hauling mangled bodies from burning half-tracks. War makes simple men into judges, and their verdict is often delivered in a heartbeat. To the Allied High Command, discipline and law remained paramount, at least on paper. Directives were circulated reminding soldiers that all captives, even SS, were to be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Yet out in the fields, these documents carried less weight than a single memory of a comrade executed after surrender. A major might lecture his men on regulations in the morning, then turn a blind eye by afternoon when an SS prisoner failed to reach the collection point. The euphemisms were many: shot while trying to escape, killed in crossfire, succumbed to wounds. But behind them lay the same grim truth: vengeance was more powerful than bureaucracy. The hatred intensified after the Malmedy massacre in December 1944, when 84 American prisoners were gunned down by SS troops of Kampfgruppe Pieper during the Battle of the Bulge. Word of the atrocity spread through the Allied lines like a contagion. Entire battalions swore oaths that there would be no mercy for the SS. From that winter onward, captured SS men faced almost certain death in the field. One American lieutenant later admitted, in the quiet candor of old age, that the massacre had changed the rules. He said simply, "If they wore the runes, we didn't bring them back." It was not only Americans. In the shattered towns of France and Belgium, British and Canadian soldiers, men who had once prided themselves on discipline, began to lose that restraint. The discovery of civilian massacres hardened their resolve. After liberating the French village of Ask, where SS troops had murdered 86 residents in reprisal, a British captain described his men's reaction in his diary: "There will be no prisoners of that sort. Not now, not after this." And yet, even as such actions multiplied, silence protected them. Reports rarely traveled up the chain of command. Commanders understood too well the fury that drove their men, and many quietly shared it. After years of total war, After seeing cities burned, friends killed, and civilians slaughtered, the moral weight of the Geneva Convention seemed light compared to the burden of memory. But vengeance alone does not explain everything. Part of the reason lay in the nature of the SS themselves. Even when defeat was inevitable, they did not behave like men surrendering a lost cause. They fought to the last round, they ambushed from basements and attics. They refused to raise white flags even when surrounded. For Allied soldiers advancing through Normandy, Arnhem, or the Ardennes, these last stands were not heroic. They were maddening. Every delay cost lives. Every cornered SS platoon seemed willing to take 100 others with them. To men who had fought their way through such defiance, the idea of granting mercy afterward felt not only pointless but dangerous. The brutality was not one-sided. In the east, the same pattern had already reached an infernal intensity. On the Russian front, the war between the Red Army and the SS was one of annihilation, stripped of all humanity. Both sides understood that capture meant death. When Soviet soldiers overran SS positions, the executions were immediate and often public. Prisoners were lined up and shot beside roads, sometimes beaten to death by civilians whose villages had been destroyed. The Red Army saw no distinction between justice and revenge. Both were delivered by the same bullet. By comparison, the Western Allies still maintained the facade of law, but only barely. For every photograph of smiling prisoners being led away under guard, there were others that no camera recorded. Shallow ditches filled before the bodies cooled, spent cartridges scattered among the grass, officers turning away in silence. And yet, to understand these moments is not to excuse them. They were the consequence of years of cruelty meeting its reflection. The Waffen-SS had made themselves the symbol of Nazi terror. In doing so, they had ensured that surrender would bring no sanctuary. When their black uniforms appeared on the battlefield, they brought with them the ghosts of Oradour, Lidis, and Babi Yar. To the men who fought them, those ghosts cried louder than any order could. In the end, no document will ever capture the full truth of those encounters. The brief instant between recognition and gunfire, the hatred that had ripened over years of slaughter, the unspoken certainty that justice in that moment was a trigger pull away. What happened in those ditches, those fields, those nameless crossroads belonged to the kind of history that no court can judge and no medal can cleanse, the dark moment when the victors of a just war stepped into the same moral shadows as the men they destroyed. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing, its borders retreating like a dying tide, its armies broken and retreating in all directions. But what the advancing Allied and Soviet forces began to uncover in those final months would defy comprehension. They had come expecting resistance, minefields, and fortified towns. Instead, they found the machinery of hell itself, and at the gates of those infernal places stood men in black or field-grey uniforms, their insignia betraying the same twin runes that had haunted Europe for a decade. When the 45th Infantry Division of the United States Army approached Dachau on April 29, they were hardened men. They had fought through Anzio and Alsace, seen comrades blown apart and burned alive. Nothing, they thought, could shock them anymore. But as they entered the rail yard outside the camp, they stopped in silence. Lined before them were dozens of boxcars, the doors hanging open, filled to the brim with corpses, thousands of them stacked like firewood, twisted and frozen in grotesque shapes. The stench was unbearable. Some of the soldiers vomited. Others simply stared motionless, unable to reconcile the scale of what they were seeing with anything human. The SS guards who had not fled were quickly rounded up and herded into a corner of the yard. They were young, some barely 20, and terrified, their faces pale beneath their caps. When questioned, they muttered the same defense. Wir haben nur Befehle befolgt. We were only following orders. But in that moment, no words could penetrate the fury of men who had just walked through carriages of death. The first shots came suddenly. One guard tried to run. A burst of automatic fire cut him down. Then another. Then another. Soon the yard echoed with the crack of rifles. American soldiers, some weeping, others shouting curses, turned their weapons on the remaining SS men. In minutes, more than 30 lay dead. Others were executed inside the camp itself, lined against a wall near the coal yard where they had once forced prisoners to labor until collapse. An officer tried to stop it, but the anger had become uncontrollable. This was not discipline anymore. It was something primal, something that had been waiting since the first reports of massacres, since the first glimpses of the true face of the SS. Elsewhere, similar scenes unfolded. At Buchenwald, liberated weeks earlier, prisoners themselves tore their tormentors apart. Survivors of years of starvation and torture stormed the camp watchtowers, dragging captured guards into the courtyards and beating them to death with shovels and bare hands. Soviet forces arriving at Majdanek and later Auschwitz found the same. The smell of burning bodies still lingered in the air. They did not bother with trials. In front of the crematoria, men in black uniforms were lined up and executed immediately. The bullets that struck them were, to those watching, not acts of cruelty but of justice delivered without delay. These scenes spread across the front like an infection of truth. Soldiers who had once dismissed stories of extermination now walked through the evidence themselves, rooms piled with human hair, lampshades made from skin, mountains of children's shoes, and gas chambers still reeking of chemicals. For many, something broke inside. The conventions of warfare, the promises of humanity, the delicate balance between soldier and executioner, all of it vanished. One American officer, arriving days later at Dachau, wrote in his journal, "There is no training for this. You cannot see this and remain a soldier. You become something else." You understand why some of the men did what they did. The same rage consumed the Red Army in the east, but multiplied by years of suffering. Entire villages had been wiped out by SS anti-partisan units. Civilians were herded into barns and burned alive, children shot alongside their parents, women hanged as terrorist collaborators. When the Soviets advanced into East Prussia and Poland, their vengeance was merciless. Columns of captured SS soldiers were marched through towns and executed in front of the survivors of their crimes. For every village reduced to ashes, the Red Army returned the favor 100-fold. No orders were needed. The hatred was self-sustaining. To the Soviets, the Waffen-SS were not prisoners of war but criminal organizations in human form. The uniform itself was proof of guilt. And so, at roadsides and forests from Königsberg to Vienna, firing squads worked without interruption. Some of the condemned tried to tear off their insignia, pleading that they were cooks or clerks. It made no difference. The black runes on their collars were enough. Even within Germany, the reckoning had begun. Civilians, now fully aware of what had been done in their name, turned on the SS with the same fury. In towns where camp guards had fled or hidden, mobs dragged them from cellars and basements, beating them to death in the streets. Wehrmacht soldiers, bitter and broken, often joined in. To them, the SS were not heroes anymore. They were the reason Germany was in ruins, the reason their families starved, the reason their homeland was now rubble beneath Allied bombs. One German sergeant was heard shouting before striking an SS officer to the ground, "You brought this on all of us." And still, amid the chaos, there were moments of hesitation, flashes of doubt that revealed the impossible burden carried by those who had become executioners. Some Allied commanders ordered investigations into the shootings at Dachau, but no one was ever court-martialed. The reports were quietly buried, the official record sanitized with bureaucratic phrasing. The prisoners were attempting escape. It was easier to look away, easier to tell oneself that in places like Dachau and Buchenwald, the normal rules no longer applied. For how could they? When confronted with the unimaginable, the mind reaches for an equally unimaginable response. What the SS had done seemed to exist outside the boundaries of law, and so the punishment, too, became lawless. To those who pulled the triggers, it was not vengeance, it was balance. But vengeance, once unleashed, is not easily contained. It spread beyond the camps, into villages, into forests, into the very soul of a continent that had been bled dry. Every shot fired into an SS prisoner was not just an act of rage, it was a reflection of the world's descent into moral exhaustion. The victors had seen too much, felt too much, lost too much to remain pure. And as Europe burned for the last time, it became clear that no one would leave the war untouched, not even those who believed themselves righteous. By May of 1945, the black uniforms that had once symbolized dominance and discipline were now death warrants. The SS men who survived did so not by courage but by erasure. cutting away their tattoos, discarding their insignia, blending into the masses of surrendering soldiers. Those who failed to hide were shot in ditches, hanged from trees, or left for the civilians to finish. In the end, there was no organized reckoning, no grand judgment from above. The true justice of that moment was carried out quietly, brutally, by the hands of those who had seen too much to forgive. And in that silence, the silence after the gunfire stopped, after the smoke cleared from the courtyards of Dachau and the killing grounds of the East, history absorbed one of its darkest truths. When horror becomes ordinary, mercy becomes impossible. The war was ending, but for the men of the SS, it was not peace that approached, it was judgment. Across the ruins of Europe, in forests, cellars, and shattered towns, thousands of them were trying to vanish, to dissolve into the sea of defeated soldiers now streaming westward in surrender. But unlike the Wehrmacht, they carried a curse that could not easily be shed. Their bodies were marked, their uniforms betrayed them, and their very faces, the pride, the arrogance, the cold discipline taught by Himmler's creed, gave them away. For the Allied soldiers searching the wreckage, finding an SS man required no special intelligence. It was written in the smallest of details, the faint outline of removed insignia, the telltale imprint of a collar badge, a patch of untanned skin where a death's head pin had once gleamed. The most damning evidence, however, lay beneath the arm. Every SS soldier bore a small tattoo, a single letter inked on the inside of the left bicep indicating his blood type. It had been intended as a mark of medical efficiency, a way for battlefield medics to save his life with the correct transfusion. Now it served the opposite purpose. When Allied forces began mass processing German prisoners, these tattoos became the simplest form of identification. At screening stations from Normandy to Bavaria, soldiers were ordered to raise their sleeves. For most Germans, it was routine. For an SS man, it was a death sentence. Once the mark was found, he was pulled aside, separated from the others. What happened next varied. Sometimes interrogation, sometimes a beating, sometimes a bullet. Many tried to remove the tattoo before capture. Some cut at their flesh with knives heated in campfires. Others pressed the barrels of pistols against their skin to burn the ink away. The scars gave them away all the same. A raw patch under the arm meant only one thing. Allied interrogators soon learned to look for the absence of the tattoo as much as for its presence. One British sergeant recalled, "If the mark was missing, you knew you had him. Nobody mutilates themselves like that for no reason." Others tried to disguise themselves as regular Wehrmacht soldiers, swapping tunics, shaving their heads, rubbing dirt over their faces, even rehearsing fake unit histories, but deception required calm and few of them possessed it. Under questioning, their arrogance cracked, their nerves betrayed them. Some trembled uncontrollably. Others spoke with the clipped tone of SS discipline even when they tried to sound ordinary. One American interrogator said later, "They carried themselves differently. Even naked, they looked like they were wearing those black uniforms." In the chaos of Germany's collapse, this difference could mean instant death. Civilians, too, had learned to recognize the signs. Towns that had been bombed to rubble, their people starved and humiliated, now hunted the men who had once ruled them. In Bavaria, villagers dragged an SS officer from his hiding place beneath a barn and paraded him through the square. His face was bloodied, his rank torn from his collar. "You told us it was for the fatherland," someone shouted before striking him with a shovel. The crowd fell upon him, and by the time Allied soldiers arrived, there was nothing left to save. Even within the ranks of the German army, the SS found no refuge. Wehrmacht soldiers, bitter and exhausted, saw them as the architects of Germany's ruin. They blamed the SS for dragging the war into fanatic suicide, for forcing hopeless defenses, for provoking Allied vengeance. In field camps across Austria and Czechoslovakia, captured SS men were quietly handed over to partisans or left unguarded long enough for locals to find them. What happened afterward was predictable. And yet, amid all this retribution, some escaped, not through cleverness, but through sheer chaos. The Western Allies, overwhelmed by millions of prisoners, could not check everyone. The paperwork piled higher than the ruins of Berlin. Men with clean faces and calm stories slipped through the cracks. They buried their uniforms, learned the names of dead soldiers, and melted into the crowds of refugees wandering the roads. Others found cover in sympathy. There were officers in the Allied camps who, weary of war, saw no purpose in vengeance. Enough killing. One American colonel was heard saying, "We have the living to feed." To him a man's sleeve or tattoo meant little beside the endless task of rebuilding. It was in those moments of fatigue, of compassion misplaced or deliberately chosen, that the guilty vanished. Still, for thousands, escape was impossible. The Allies' hatred was too fresh, the evidence too clear. When Soviet troops entered Germany from the east, their treatment of SS prisoners was direct and absolute. Columns of captured men were marched to the edge of forests and shot without hesitation. In some cases, villagers were summoned to witness the executions, a form of symbolic justice, the mirror of the atrocities the SS had once performed in those same fields. A Red Army officer later explained to a correspondent, "They were not soldiers, they were the hangmen of our people." In the West, the response was quieter, but no less final. Reports of accidental deaths multiplied in the prisoner records. A truck overturned on a forest road. A sentry fired at a fleeing captive. None of these events were ever investigated. The command chain had learned to look away. The moral logic was simple. These men had chosen their loyalty, and now they would pay its price. The irony of their situation was inescapable. The SS had prided itself on purity, discipline, and loyalty unto death, and death in the end was loyal to them. The same insignia they had worn with pride now glowed like a target. The blood tattoo that had been meant to preserve life had become an execution warrant. Every symbol of their faith, the black uniform, the rune, the skull, had turned against them. As spring gave way to summer in 1945, the roads of Germany were filled with men who no longer dared to look each other in the eye. Some carried false papers, some walked alone through the forests afraid of the next patrol. Some, when confronted by Allied troops, did not even attempt to run. They stood, closed their eyes, and whispered, "Do it quickly." There was no honor left to protect, no cause left to die for, only the silence of defeat. For the SS, the end did not come on the battlefield, but in the slow realization that their symbols, once sacred, now condemned them wherever they went. And as the Allied soldiers searched the ditches and the ruins, as the Red Army swept through the villages, as civilians whispered and pointed and dragged the guilty from hiding, one truth lingered across Europe like a shadow that refused to fade. The mark of the SS was not just on the arm, it was on the soul. By May of 1945, the Reich was dead, and yet its poison still lingered in the blood of Europe. Cities were in ashes, bridges collapsed, rivers choked with the debris of a nation that had tried to make itself immortal. The men who once called themselves the Waffen-SS, who had sworn an oath to Adolf Hitler unto death, were now living ghosts wandering through that ruin, hunted, despised, and stripped of every illusion of glory. The empire they had served no longer existed, only the consequences remained. For years they had been told that surrender was dishonor, that death in battle was the only redemption, that their Führer's cause was eternal. But the myth had shattered with the sound of the last artillery rounds over Berlin. Hitler was dead by his own hand. Himmler had been captured in disguise and swallowed poison like a coward, and the men who had worshipped them were now left to face a world that regarded them not as soldiers, but as executioners. The oaths they had once spoken beneath banners and torches now marked them for extinction. Across the countryside, thousands of SS men tried to disappear. Some buried their uniforms beneath barns or in shallow ditches. Others burned their identity papers and traded insignia for rags. But it was too late. Their faces were known, their accents betrayed their training and their arrogance, that silent, disciplined posture drilled into them through years of ideological worship, remained impossible to disguise. Even without the black uniform, people could still see it. The way they stood, the way they looked through others instead of at them. Civilians who had endured 6 years of fear and humiliation no longer trembled before these men. They spat at them, cursed them, hunted them. In small towns across Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, the same grim ritual played out again and again. Someone would point, he was SS, and the crowd would close in. The justice of the street was immediate and primitive. Ropes appeared from windows, shovels from doorways. The same people who had once saluted now hurled stones. The symbols of authority had inverted overnight. The servants of terror were now its victims. In the cities where the Allied occupation was still being organized, the Wehrmacht, desperate to salvage a fragment of honor, often turned against the SS as well. Regular soldiers, their pride in ruins, blamed the fanatics for everything, for the war's prolongation, for the destruction of their homeland, for the loss of their families. In the final days before surrender, entire SS units were shot by their own comrades in grey who refused to die for Hitler's delusion any longer. One witness near Hamburg recalled a group of Wehrmacht men dragging several SS officers to the roadside and executing them with the words "for Stalingrad, for Dresden, for everything." The vengeance was not only German. In the East, Soviet retribution became apocalyptic. Villages that had been wiped off the map by SS death squads now saw their tormentors march through the same ruins, bound together with wire. No trial, no defense, no hesitation. The Red Army had lost 20 million lives. There was no forgiveness left to offer. "We will not feed wolves," a Soviet commander was recorded saying before ordering the shooting of 40 captured SS men, to him and to many others. The executions were not crimes but cleansing, the closing of a circle that had begun with Babi Yar, Minsk and Smolensk. Even in the West, where law and order were more strictly enforced, the distinction between justice and vengeance was porous. The Allied command issued directives demanding that all prisoners of war, regardless of affiliation, be treated according to the Geneva Convention, but on the ground, where discipline had eroded into exhaustion, few men cared for regulations written in offices far from the front. "Paper can't bury our dead," one American lieutenant said, when asked why he had refused to intervene in the execution of SS prisoners near the Ruhr. The statement was never written in any report, but everyone understood it. For those SS men who managed to survive the first weeks of retribution, the struggle became one of disguise and denial. Many fled toward the mountains. Others melted into refugee columns, inventing new names and histories. Some found shelter in monasteries or among sympathetic clergy who saw them as lost souls in need of redemption. A few even joined forced labor teams under assumed identities, breaking rocks and clearing mines in the same fields they had once conquered. But no matter how far they fled, the mark of the SS followed them, not only on their skin but in the nightmares of the world that remembered them. In the years that followed, Allied investigators began the slow, meticulous task of identifying and prosecuting war criminals. Nuremberg would become the symbol of this reckoning, a courtroom where the masks of authority were torn away and the world stared directly at the architects of genocide. Yet the majority of SS men never stood there. Tens of thousands escaped through chaos, silence, or complicity. Some fled to South America through secret rat lines organized by sympathizers. Others lived quiet lives under false names, blending into the post-war fog. They became bakers, carpenters, mechanics, fathers, ordinary men hiding extraordinary guilt. Still, for many, the punishment never required a judge. It came in whispers, in nightmares, in the knowledge that they could never speak their past aloud. For them, survival was a slower kind of death, a life lived in fear of recognition, of the knock on the door, of the newspaper headline that might reveal everything. The empire that had promised them immortality had left them haunted instead. Those who had sworn never to surrender had been destroyed by the very ideology that demanded such faith. Their fanaticism had isolated them from mercy, from comradeship, from humanity itself. Even when the fighting stopped, the war continued inside them. Some took their own lives rather than face capture. Others drank themselves into oblivion in post-war taverns, muttering old slogans into their beer until they were thrown out into the street. They were relics of a cause that had burned itself to ashes, and in the eyes of the world they were beyond redemption. By the late 1940s, Europe was rebuilding, but beneath the new foundations lay unburied ghosts. The SS had not only stained their uniforms, they had poisoned the meaning of loyalty, obedience, and faith. Every street rebuilt over their ruins was a reminder of what blind conviction could create and destroy. The men who once believed themselves chosen had discovered the final irony of their creed, that total devotion leads not to immortality but to annihilation. The oath they had spoken to Hitler had been fulfilled to the letter. They had followed him unto death. And as Germany slowly rose from the ashes, one lesson endured, carved into the collective memory of a continent that had seen too much fanaticism may inspire armies, but it cannot survive the peace. When the guns finally fell silent and Europe lay in ruins, the world believed that justice would be swift, that the guilty would be hunted down, the camps avenged, the men who had built the SS machine brought before the eyes of civilization. For a brief, furious moment it seemed that would happen. The Nuremberg trials began under bright lights and heavy cameras, the surviving leaders of the Reich standing behind glass like specimens of a new species of evil. But outside those marble courtrooms, in the wreckage of a continent that could barely feed itself, another story was unfolding, quieter, darker, and far more enduring. Among the millions of displaced people wandering through the rubble, refugees, prisoners, deserters, widows, orphans, hid thousands of SS men. They were no longer warriors or ideologues. They were ghosts moving through the smoke of defeat, unshaven, nameless, desperate. Some tore their insignia from their uniforms and walked west toward American lines, gambling on the relative mercy of the Western Allies over the vengeful fury of the Red Army. Others found hiding places in monasteries where sympathetic priests offered them food, shelter, and, sometimes, new identities. A few even found work with Allied authorities as translators or drivers, presenting themselves as innocent civilians who had simply served in the army. The chaos of post-war Germany made deception possible. Allied interrogation centers were overwhelmed, records were incomplete, photos missing, names confused by the tide of humanity pouring through the ruins. The sheer scale of defeat created a fog in which monsters could vanish. A man who said his papers were lost in a bombing raid was as believable as one who said he had been a baker or a clerk. In that confusion, the black uniforms were gone, but the men who had worn them were still there. Soon, organized escape networks began to form. Some were improvised by former comrades, others were assisted, knowingly or not, by church officials and international aid groups trying to manage the humanitarian crisis. The most infamous of these networks would later be known as Odessa, a web of former SS officers who arranged false documents, safe houses, and passage out of Europe. The routes ran south through Italy and Spain, across the ports of Genoa and Barcelona, and on to new worlds far from the reach of Allied justice. In South America, a new Reich of ghosts began to take shape. Argentina under Juan Perón offered sanctuary, seeing in these men both anti-communist allies and skilled professionals. Ships arrived in Buenos Aires carrying engineers, doctors, and officers who had once served in the Waffen-SS or Gestapo. They came under false names, their pasts erased by forged Red Cross passports, their pockets lined with gold, diamonds, and currency looted from the dead. Among them were figures who had overseen entire massacres, who had commanded death camps. Men like Joseph Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death of Auschwitz, who lived quietly under a false identity, practicing medicine in rural towns. Others fled to Chile, Brazil, or Paraguay, blending into the expatriate German communities that had existed there since before the war. They built modest lives, opened bakeries, factories, and car repair shops, joined local churches, and raised families. To their neighbors, they were polite and hard-working. Only rarely did the mask slip, an accent too sharp, a tattoo glimpsed by accident, a story told with too much certainty about a place that should have been unknown to them. Back in Europe, Allied investigators continued their search. The newly formed War Crimes Unit scoured archives, interrogated witnesses, and followed rumors, but the early Cold War soon shifted priorities. The Soviet threat grew, and suddenly some former Nazis were no longer enemies, they were useful. Scientists, intelligence officers, and even former SS men with knowledge of Soviet operations were quietly recruited by Western agencies. In Washington and London, pragmatism replaced vengeance. Files were sealed, names were omitted. The same hands that had built the Reich's war machine now helped build new ones, this time against Moscow. For the survivors of the camps and the soldiers who had seen the horrors firsthand, this betrayal was unbearable. They had watched comrades fall, had buried the evidence of crimes too vast to describe, and now they saw the perpetrators vanish into new lives unpunished. In the late 1950s and 60s, a new generation of Nazi hunters emerged, men like Simon Wiesenthal, who devoted their lives to tracking the fugitives who had escaped justice. With dogged persistence, they uncovered identities, traced letters, interviewed neighbors, and passed their findings to governments that had long preferred to forget. Their work brought a handful of the guilty back into the light. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust's logistics, was discovered in Argentina in 1960, living under the name Ricardo Clement. Mossad agents abducted him and flew him to Israel, where he stood trial in a courtroom filled with survivors who had once been numbers on his transport lists. When he was hanged in 1962, his ashes were scattered over the sea so that no place on earth could bear his grave. Others were less fortunate, or more. Mengele drowned anonymously in Brazil in 1979, buried under a false name, his secret discovered only years later. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, lived comfortably in Bolivia for decades before being extradited to France in the 1980s. He smiled in court, unrepentant to the end. For every one captured, a dozen others died in silence, their crimes forgotten by all but their victims. The moral reckoning that followed the war never reached them all. The world had moved on, weary of justice, hungry for peace, eager to rebuild. The black uniforms had been burned, the camps turned into museums, the trials ended. But beneath the quiet streets of post-war Europe, the memory remained, an undercurrent of shame, guilt, and the uneasy knowledge that the line between justice and vengeance had been crossed by all sides. And yet, in the larger sense, the SS never truly escaped. The runes, the skulls, the ideology, they became symbols of absolute evil, stripped of glamour, studied and condemned. The mythology of the elite soldier was gone. What remained was a legacy of fanaticism that had devoured its own believers. The men who fled across oceans could not flee the century itself. History had already judged them. In the end, those who lived out their days in hiding, whether under the sun of South America or in the suburbs of Munich, lived not in victory but in exile from the very world they had tried to rule. Their triumph had turned to dust, their loyalty to ashes, their cause to nothing. And in that nothingness lay their final punishment. The slow realization that they had built a 1,000-year empire that lasted barely 12, and that the only immortality they had achieved was infamy. Because when history speaks of the SS, it does not speak of glory or courage or loyalty. It speaks of the moment when obedience replaced humanity, and of how, in the end, even the most disciplined army cannot escape the weight of its own conscience. The war ended, but its shadows did not decades later. In the calm of a world rebuilt from rubble, the name Schutzstaffel still carries the chill of something that never fully died, a reminder that ideology, when stripped of compassion, can turn ordinary men into instruments of annihilation. The SS were not demons from another realm. They were human beings who learned to think as if they were not. That perhaps is the most terrifying truth of all. They had begun as guards and protectors, the shield of a man, the armor of a movement, and yet, in the feverish devotion that followed, they became the architects of a world that devoured itself. Their loyalty, once praised as virtue, transformed into the perfect tool for evil. It was not hatred alone that built the death camps or executed surrendering soldiers in ditches. It was obedience, blind, disciplined, and absolute. That obedience, raised to the level of faith, demanded sacrifices not only from their victims but from the very soul of the men who served. When the Reich fell, the world tried to separate justice from vengeance, to rebuild laws where morality had collapsed. But the truth is more complex and more painful. On the fields of Europe, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and the silent courtyards of Dachau, the victors of a just war sometimes became judges, executioners, and avengers. They acted not from ideology, but from exhaustion, from the unbearable knowledge of what the SS had done. It was retribution, born in the moment when language and law failed to contain the horror of what they had witnessed. In that sense, the fate of the SS became a mirror for humanity itself. They had stripped their enemies of mercy. In the end, mercy was stripped from them. They had declared whole peoples unworthy of life. In the end, they found their own lives deemed unworthy of law. History does not forgive symmetry like that. It remembers it with unease, as if to whisper that once the machinery of hate begins to turn, it grinds down everyone caught in its gears. The post-war world was built on the ashes of this lesson. The Geneva Conventions were strengthened, human rights codified, tribunals created to ensure that never again would a soldier be able to say, "I was only following orders." Yet even these measures were born from guilt, not triumph. They were the desperate attempt of civilization to rebuild the fences it had broken down. For the SS themselves, there was no redemption. Some found religion, some confessed, most stayed silent. They aged, they died, they were buried quietly. their medals gone, their names erased from memorials. But their story endured, not as legend, but as warning. Each photograph of a black uniform in a museum, each pair of silver runes in a display case, speaks not of strength, but of the moral collapse that comes when conviction replaces conscience. And so the question lingers: how does a human being become capable of such obedience? How does loyalty transform into cruelty and ideology into annihilation? The answers are uncomfortable because they are not confined to one nation, one war, or one moment in history. They live in every society that chooses certainty over empathy, purity over compassion, hierarchy over humanity. The SS were not born from madness. They were made by belief. When Allied soldiers shot captured SS men on the battlefield, it was vengeance, yes, but it was also a terrible recognition. They saw in those men not something alien, but something familiar taken to its extreme. They saw what happens when faith in authority eclipses all else, when the human heart is trained to beat in rhythm with ideology, and they feared that in the right circumstances anyone might be capable of the same. 80 years have passed, and still the lessons remain fragile. The uniforms are gone, the camps are quiet, the witnesses are dying. But history is never silent. It murmurs beneath the noise of the present, reminding us that evil rarely begins with blood. It begins with conviction, with certainty, with the comfort of believing that one's cause is pure. From there, the rest follows with mechanical precision. The SS dreamed of a 1,000-year empire. They built instead a scar across the conscience of the world. Their story is not only about power and cruelty, it is about what happens when the human spirit surrenders to obedience, when justice in response forgets mercy. And so in the stillness after the war, amid the graves and the ghosts, a single truth emerged from the ruin, one that outlived the Reich, the runes, and the men who wore them. Fanaticism dies, but its echo endures, and every generation must choose whether it will listen to that echo or repeat it.